Richard's suitcase was already by the door, his phone pressed to his ear, voice clipped and distracted. Clara stood in the hallway, arms folded loosely, pretending not to notice how quickly his mind had left the room, even before his body would. He gave her a quick kiss, a perfunctory smile, and was gone, the door clicking shut in a way that felt too final for just a business trip. The silence that followed was heavy, filling the house like a slow tide. She exhaled, letting the stillness wrap around her, though the quiet only made the emptiness sharper. When she heard the front door again, later that afternoon. She expected the sound of keys she didn't recognize, but it was Ethan's voice. That came instead deeper than she remembered, carrying the casual confidence of someone who'd spent months away from home. He appeared in the doorway with an easy grin, the kind that made it hard to measure where boyhood had ended and something else had begun. His hug was warm but brief, his hand resting on her shoulder a moment longer than expected. They caught up over coffee, his stories tumbling out in quick succession, a mixture of university life and plans for the summer. She listened, noting the way he spoke, now slower, more deliberate, as though aware of the weight of his words. He asked about her days, and though she kept her answers light, she felt him watching her more closely than before. When he complimented the way she wore her hair, she brushed it off with a small laugh, telling herself it was nothing. The days slid into an easy rhythm, and she found herself noticing little changes she hadn't before. The breadth of his shoulders, the way his voice lingered at the edge of a laugh, the confidence in his gaze. None of it meant anything, she told herself, but still, when he leaned across the table to hand her something, she felt the warmth of his arm near hers and didn't pull away as quickly as she might have. One night, the house was dim except for the kitchen light. She patted in for a glass of water and found him already there, leaning against the counter, sipping tea. They spoke quietly, voices low in the hush of the late hour. The conversation wandered easily, small observations and inside jokes forming an unspoken thread between them. When he reached for the sugar, his fingers brushed hers, not by accident, she thought, though she couldn't be sure. He didn't move his hand immediately, and for a moment, neither did she. She went to bed that night, feeling the echo of that touch, the way it had made her heart trip in her chest. It was nothing, she repeated, but the image returned again the next morning, unbidden. There was a pull there she couldn't quite define, something between curiosity and caution, as though she'd stepped too close to the edge of a place she'd never meant to go. The summer air was warm and heavy, the kind that made the afternoons slow and drowsy. They spent time together without planning it. She'd be in the garden and he'd wander out, or she'd be making lunch and he'd offer to help. The conversations grew easier, punctuated by quiet moments where their eyes met and neither looked away first. She noticed he'd begun to stand closer when they spoke, his hand sometimes brushing the small of her back when he passed behind her. One afternoon, he made her laugh so unexpectedly that she found herself touching his arm in reflex, her fingers curling slightly before she realized. He smiled in a way that told her he'd noticed. The air between them seemed to shift then, a subtle change that made her pulse quicken. She told herself she was imagining it, that it was just the intimacy of shared space. But the thought didn't quite settle. By the end of that week, she was more aware of him than she wanted to admit to herself, to anyone. A glance held a second too long, a joke that seemed to mean more, a brush of skin that felt intentional. It was harmless, she reasoned. Just a tension in a place where there had been none for too long. But somewhere beneath that thin defense, she knew the truth. A tension had a way of growing roots if left unchecked, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to pull them out or see how deep they could go. The call came late in the evening, Richard's voice brisk, telling her the trip would stretch another week. Clara said she understood, masking the flicker of relief she felt as she ended the call. The house seemed to exhale, and without thinking, She found herself looking for Ethan. He was in the living room, stretched out casually, eyes on her in a way that made her skin warm before either of them spoke. Their days began to fold into one another. Breakfast blurred into errands into cooking side by side, conversations drifting easily into comfortable silences. She noticed how he listened, not just to her words, but to the pauses between them, the things she didn't say. When she mentioned how quiet the house felt without Richard, his gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary, as if weighing the space those words left open. They spoke more about themselves than they ever had before. Ethan confessed to feeling constantly measured against his father, a way he could never quite shake. Clara admitted that marriage had become something steady but hollow, like a house well kept but never lived in. Neither of them said it outright, but each understood the other's hunger for something more than routine. It was in the small things that the line began to fade. A hand on her back guiding her through a doorway. The way he would stand close enough for her to catch the faint scent of his cologne. She told herself it was harmless, yet her body responded before her mind could argue. One rainy afternoon, the storm rattled the windows and dimmed the rooms into a muted glow. They sat together on the couch, sharing a blanket without thinking, their conversation moving in quiet currents. He asked if she'd ever imagined a different life, one where she'd chosen differently. She answered honestly sometimes, yes. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his mouth, and asked, "And if you had the chance to change something now?" She didn't answer right away, but she didn't look away either. There was a new weight in the air then, unspoken, but undeniable. His hand shifted, fingers brushing against hers under the blanket. She could have moved. Instead, she stayed still, feeling the heat of that touch seep into her. The question hung between them, unvoiced but understood. In the kitchen later, the Nurnes continued reaching for the same plate, leaning in to hear a half-whispered joke. She felt her pulse in her throat when his arm grazed hers. It would have been easy to draw a clear line, to remind them both of what they were, but the part of her that had been starved for this kind of attention wasn't ready to let it go. That night, she lingered in the hallway outside his room, unsure if she'd gone there out of chance or choice. His door was slightly open, light spilling onto the floor. He looked up from where he sat, and there was no mistaking what was in his eyes: curiosity, want, and the faintest challenge. She felt the pull like a thread wound tight between them. The moment stretched. She could have stepped back, laughed it off, gone to bed and locked the door. Instead, she stood there, the silence thick around them, and let the seconds pass without ending them. He didn't speak, and neither did she, but her lack of movement was answer enough. Later, lying awake, she turned over the events in her mind, not the details, but the choice. She hadn't sought it, but she hadn't stopped it either. That was the truth that sat heavily in her chest, steady and inescapable. It wasn't just a lapse, it was a decision. And decisions, she knew, were not easily undone. The morning light felt sharper than usual, slipping through the blinds in thin, accusing lines. Clara moved through the kitchen with deliberate calm, her hands busy with simple tasks while her thoughts kept circling the same point. She didn't need to look at Ethan to know he was watching her. She could feel it, a quiet awareness threading between them. His voice was casual when he asked if she'd slept well, but the slight curve in his tone carried the weight of shared knowledge. They didn't speak about what had passed. The silence between them wasn't avoidance, it was agreement. Words would only make it heavier, more real. Instead, their interactions folded into the rhythm of the day, laced with small acknowledgments only they could read. When he reached for a mug, his hand brushed hers, and neither moved away too quickly. When she passed him in the hall, his shoulder lingered against hers, as though confirming they still remembered. Richard called that afternoon. his voice full of travel plans and minor frustrations. Clara responded with practiced warmth, her tone steady even as she noticed Ethan in the next room, close enough to hear every word. The duality of it made her pulse quicken, one part of her tethered to the familiar role of wife, the other anchored to the quiet thrill of what she'd chosen not to stop. Asterisk. The days until his departure moved faster than she expected. There was no dramatic change in their behavior, no reckless closeness in public spaces. The difference was quieter, threaded into glances and the faintest curve of a smile when their eyes met. At night, lying in bed alone, she would replay moments in her mind, not with regret, but with a muted disbelief that she had crossed that line so willingly. Asterisk on the last morning. The air between them felt different, lighter in words, heavier in everything unspoken. He loaded his bag into the car, turning to her with a look that hovered between a goodbye and a promise. His hug was firm, lingering just long enough for her to catch the faint scent she'd grown too used to over the summer. When he stepped back, his expression didn't break, but the pause before he spoke told her there were things neither dared to say aloud. Asterisk. After he left, the house felt larger, but not emptier. It was as if the walls had absorbed the weight of what had happened, holding it in their silence. She moved through the rooms, straightening cushions, rinsing cups, each small act returning her to the life she had before, though it no longer felt like the same life at all. Asterisk. When Richard returned, she greeted him with the same careful smile she'd worn for years. He spoke of flights and meetings, of the people he'd seen, the deals he'd closed. She nodded, asked the right questions, poured his drink. The ease between them was practiced, but somewhere deep in her, something had shifted, a subtle dissonance. That made even the most ordinary gestures feel different. Asterisk. At night, lying beside him, she wondered if he noticed. If he sensed the faint change in her, the way her gaze sometimes drifted to places he couldn't follow. She thought of Ethan, not in vivid scenes, but in the way one thinks of a choice made in a moment that can't be unmade. It wasn't longing. Not exactly. More the awareness of a truth that had rooted itself inside her, steady and unshakable. Asterisk. Life continued, as it always does. The routines resumed, the days filled with the usual conversations, the same small comforts. But beneath it all, she carried the knowledge like a hidden ember, quiet, contained, yet still warm. She didn't know if it would fade with time or if it would remain, waiting, ready to spark again. What she did know was this: once a line is crossed, it doesn't vanish. It becomes part of the map you carry, a point you can never pretend you didn't reach. Richard's return settled into the house like a weight Clara couldn't quite shift. His presence filled the rooms in a way that should have felt grounding, but instead made her more aware of the space between them. He spoke with the same steady cadence, his hand resting on her shoulder in passing, his smile unchanged. She responded in kind, matching his tone and rhythm. But beneath the surface, her mind kept circling the gap between appearances and truth. Asterisk. Ethan's absence had left a quiet that was different from the one before. This silence wasn't empty, it was layered, carrying the residue of glances, touches, and choices made in moments that could never be unwound. Every so often, she caught herself replaying small fragments without meaning to. The tilt of his head when he listened, the way his voice lowered when speaking just to her, the unspoken acknowledgement that had passed between them. Asterisk. In conversations with Richard, she noticed herself hesitating before answering, not because she didn't know what to say, but because part of her was measuring whether the truth might somehow seep through. When he asked about her summer, she kept her words light and unremarkable, skipping over the heat in certain days, the charged stillness in certain nights. He accepted her version without question, unaware of the edits she had made. Asterisk. The weeks moved forward, each one smoothing over the edges of what had happened, but never erasing them. Clara went about her routines: laundry, groceries, polite dinners. with friends, yet felt as though she was living in two separate timelines. In one, she was the wife she had always been, dependable and constant. In the other, she was someone who had stood still in a hallway, not stepping back when she knew she should have. Richard seemed content, or at least comfortable, and she found herself studying him for signs of doubt that never appeared. The absence of suspicion didn't bring relief. If anything, it deepened her unease. His trust was intact, and that trust now felt like something she was carrying on borrowed time. There were moments when her phone would buzz, and she would feel a sudden rush of anticipation, only to find it was nothing more than a friend or a notification. She never reached out to Ethan, and he never contacted her, but the lack of communication didn't close the distance. It kept it suspended, an unfinished thread left hanging in the air. One evening, as Richard recounted his story from his trip, she caught herself drifting, her mind sliding back to a rainy afternoon, a blanket, a question she hadn't answered. The memory wasn't vivid in detail. It was vivid in sensation, in the way it had made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. She forced herself back into the conversation, nodding and smiling at the right moments, but the shift inside her remained. She began to realize that the danger wasn't in what had happened. It was in how easily it had fit into the spaces of her life, how seamlessly it could be hidden without disrupting the surface. That knowledge stayed with her, heavy but also strangely grounding. She understood now how people could live entire lives carrying things they never spoke of. The first time Richard kissed her after his return, she kissed him back with practiced ease, but somewhere deep inside, she knew the part of herself that had been given away would not return. It wasn't regret she felt, not exactly. It was the awareness of a permanent shift, like a hairline crack in glass, small, almost invisible, but always there. As the season began to change, so did the texture of her days. The heat of summer gave way to cooler mornings, but the warmth of what she'd experienced lingered, quiet but insistent. She didn't seek it again, yet she didn't bury it either. It remained with her, a silent reminder that some choices are less about the moment they happen, and more about how they change the way you see yourself afterward. Clara knew she could continue as if nothing had altered. She could cook dinners, hold conversations, play her role with precision. But she also knew she would never unknow the truth. When Ethan had wanted more, she hadn't stopped him, not because she was powerless, but because a part of her had wanted it too. And that truth, she realized, would live in her long after the summer itself was gone.